I would expect that once they announce that the international flights are available, I would expect to see a big rush. Singapore Airlines, their website crashed recently when the vaccinated travel lanes were announced. So I'd expect to see something similar again, everyone clambering to get a flight, particularly if there's any possibility of the Christmas holidays being spent in Australia. I know a lot of Singaporeans tend to travel to Australia around Christmas time, historically before COVID. And there's also lots of Australian expats here as well who will be equally keen to get home for the Christmas break, see their family. It's been a long time, nearly 2 years since a lot of people have seen their family. So I would expect to probably see websites for plane companies crashing again with that much pent-up demand.
What kind of border controls does Singapore have for its returning residents? Is there a quarantine or testing regime in place?
So it now varies on where you're coming from. So if it's a vaccinated travel lane, it's now just a case of testing negative. You arrive back into Singapore, have another test, and then once that is negative, you're allowed to go about your business. But certain countries now are ranked depending on things like vaccination rates and levels of infection. So at the moment, if you were coming back from Australia, it's around about 7 days of quarantine, but you can do that in your home. So if you've got an apartment here or a flat, you're allowed to go in and spend 7 days at home there rather than having to do it in a facility. The longest quarantine now is 10 days. It was recently lowered from 14. So certain countries, you still have to go and do 10 days in a facility, which is usually a hotel, and spend 10 days quarantining there before you're allowed to go out and about. I wouldn't be surprised to see a reduction in quarantine for people coming from Australia, particularly if tourism opens up into Australia from Singapore. I would expect that to be reciprocated here, and Australians would probably be able to travel here without quarantine in the near future.
So you mentioned that Singapore has made some deals with other countries for travel lanes. How have they been working out so far?
Yep. Recently, so the first one was Germany, and that's been in place for probably about 6 weeks at the moment. That's been very popular. I think around 1,000 people have come so far. Many people are, expats who have decided to go back to Europe, see their family, then go and spend a couple of weeks in Germany before heading back to Singapore. But there have been a couple of tourists as well, or German families who have relations here or friends coming to visit. So that was a success, and the scheme only picked up one person who tested positive when they arrived into Singapore. From then on, they've branched out. So we now have the UK, the US, several countries in Europe, and the scheme is expanding to Korea as well in November. And they've been massively popular. A lot of people have been put off by the quarantine, so they've been waiting to go and travel to their home country or just go and travel to a different country until there was no quarantine. So now that they have come out, and they're actually very affordable at the moment. The airfares aren't too bad. The only issue is the cost of testing. It's around about 100 Singaporean dollars for a PCR test here. And obviously some countries like Korea, for example, you have to test when you arrive there as well. But people in the main are keen. Most people you speak to are planning a trip generally around Christmas time. But yeah, they've been a huge success so far. And I think it will be the kind of future of travel in this country for a while.
What's the COVID situation like in Singapore at the moment?
So we are reporting very high case numbers at the moment. The last couple of days have been over 3,000. The government expects it to go even higher. There's talk of 5, possibly 10,000 cases a day at some point. The caveat is to say that Singapore does test an enormous amount of people. Most people have to test once or twice a week. School children are tested regularly. So they do pick up a lot of cases in that way. But the cases really have exploded in recent weeks, certainly compared to how they've been for most of the pandemic. Once we kind of reached 80% double vaccinated, the cases kind of rose as we kind of reached that landmark, despite the fact that we didn't really fully open up. But the government now, they're still trying to learn to live with the virus. They're very keen to kind of move away from COVID zero and move away from some of the restrictions, but they are struggling at the moment, and hospitals here are under pressure. There's been situations where people have been visiting hospital after they tested positive for COVID, even if they don't have really severe symptoms, and that's been putting a lot of strain on the healthcare system. So restrictions are in place at the moment. As I mentioned, you can only have 2 people in a group. You can go out to bars and restaurants, but again, you can only sit on a table of 2, and most of them close at 10:30 when the alcohol curfew comes in. And there's certain limits like sports, for example, you can't go and play football with people, and you can't meet in people's houses with bigger groups. So there are a lot of restrictions that we still live under here. And mask wearing is also very strictly imposed as well. So pretty much whenever you're outside the house, you have to wear a mask unless you're sat at a table eating or drinking, or if you're engaged in some exercise.
Quite strict. So on a more personal note, as an expat, what's it been like riding out the pandemic in Singapore?
It's been long, I think, would be the way to describe it. It's kind of, as for everyone really, it's kind of gone in stages. So I'm from the UK, and when they were in a very hard lockdown, particularly last winter, and they had a lot of cases, a lot of deaths, it did not look a good place to be. Whereas in Singapore, we had effectively zero COVID. We were open as much as we have been. It was sunny, so it was a good place to be. But slowly, as Europe and the UK have come back to some kind of normality, it's been a strange experience from here, where we've been in lockdowns and we've had a lot of restrictions. It's very odd to watch everybody else travelling and going back to normal whilst we've been in that scenario. So it's actually got harder as time has passed.